Sandro Botticelli, an independent master of the early Renaissance and a major figure of its history. Swept into the golden age of the great Florentine school under the patronage of Lorenzo Medici, Sandro would spend most of his life in religious and portrait work, when, in the decade of 1470, would arrive his great blossoming. The mythological masterworks he created during the following decade of 1480 would come to define him. In later life, Botticelli would be caught amidst the religious fervour of the Dominican friar Savonarola, as was most of Florence at the time, and his posthumous reputation would suffer as a result, swept away and overshadowed by more prominent names, more befitting perhaps of the Medici's legacy and Vasari's vision of the Renaissance. The son of a tanner, Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippi was born in Florence in the streets of Via Borgio Ognissanti, and the youngest of his father Mariano's surviving children. The exact date of his birth is not known, but is considered to be sometime in 1445. Sandro had 3 brothers, one of whom, Antonio, a beater of gold leaf, soon found his father, Mariano, joining him in the business. The art and goldsmith worlds being intertwined would put the family in touch with artists, as, only a year later in 1461, Sandro would be apprenticed to Fra Filippo Lippi, a well-regarded painter in his own right and frequent patron of the Medicis, one of the most powerful families in Florence. Lippi would hold an influence over Botticelli's works and style to come. Botticelli would leave Lippi's tutelage in early 1467, but the influence of the conservative master upon Sandro should not be understated, as much of the Gothic influence present in Lippi would translate over to Botticelli. Around the year of 1467, Sandro would begin a workshop of his own. After Lippi passed in 1469, the mentor's son, Filippino, would finish his apprenticeship with Botticelli in an interesting case of the apprentice becoming the master. Filippino would become a successful artist himself, so much so in fact that on the day of his burial it is said that all the workshops in the city closed for him. In June of 1472, his earliest and accurately dated work, commissioned as part of a set of panels depicting the 7 virtues by commercial judges interested in having them made for their court. The commission was for 2 of the 7 panels, yet only one, named Fortitude, was made. This act of half-finishing works and commissions would become quite frequent in Sandro's life, although it is not known exactly why. Another of his earliest works would be his own rendition of a popular genre at this time in Florence, of the so-called Holy Conversation. It is known as the Pala di San Ambrogio, now in the Uffizi. It is not in the best of condition, nor can it be accurately dated. An early work that can be accurately dated is his Saint Sebastian of January 1474. Itself somewhat unique, as Botticelli would rarely approach nudity, especially when depicting Christian scenes, although, paradoxically, his works that contain full and partial nudity are what he is most remembered for, despite this accounting for a very small percentage of his total output. His Adorations of the Magi would come the following years of 1775 to 1776, the first of 8 in the Adorations series, one which garnered rare praise from Vasari, the Renaissance's great and first historian, whose influential words for Botticelli did not come very often. This work is also significant, not only for being considered the climax of his early career, but for the figures depicted. For the portraits of these figures contain all 5 of the Medici sons, from Cosimo to his sons Piero and Giovanni, who are dead at this time, along with his grandsons Lorenzo and Giuliano. Is it a coincidence that Vasari, whose interest was promoting the Medici family's legacy, would praise such a work? Along with the Medici scions is the portrait of the donor, along with Botticelli himself on the far right. There are 3 known lost works of this period: a fresco and his first real major commission, ironically depicting the Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici of 1478, and was maybe the catalyst for his future summons to Rome. Ironic because it would be later destroyed during the Medici expulsion by the Pazzi in 1494. A tondo and fresco were also lost at this time. The latter lost in the time of Vasari in the next century, apparently because Vasari remodelled the Palazzo Vecchio where it resided. One of the leading families of Ognissanti was the Vespucci, who were allies of the Medici, commissioned what is perhaps the last work of Botticelli before he left for Rome, although this is not entirely certain, his St. Augustine, which is the earliest fresco of Botticelli's to survive, and to be for the local church. Alongside his St. Augustine was commissioned by the order of the same church, a facing St. Jerome by Domenico Ghirlandaio. The competitive nature of Botticelli alongside Domenico would mark his St. Augustine as one of his most spectacular frescoes, embodying his playful nature with a subtle joke embedded in the text on the book above the saint. During his early career and all throughout, Botticelli would paint a number of Madonnas and portraits throughout his life. These would become somewhat of a staple of his career. In 1481, Pope Sixtus IV summoned the great Florentine and Umbrian artists of the day to fresco the walls of the freshly built Sistine Chapel. Botticelli was among them. The Florentine contribution is thought to be a reconciliation or peace between Lorenzo and Sixtus due to the Pope's prior implication in the Pazzi conspiracy. As would become the history of the Sistine Chapel, of course, most work during this time would sit sadly dull in the shadow of Michelangelo's grand legacy of his ceiling that would follow in the next century to come. The scheme of the work, on opposite ends of the chapel facing each other, was on one side depicting the life of Moses and on the other the life of Christ. The Sistine Chapel deserves a video in and of itself, as the nature of the work here is very complex and also murky at times, but all in all, the theme is essentially papal supremacy as is suggested with the aforementioned works. Of the original 14 scenes, Botticelli and his workshop contributed to 3, the Temptations of Christ, the Sons of Korah, and the Youth of Moses, along with several of the imagined portraits of popes on the upper level, to which he contributed to around 15, and 10 are directly attributed to him. Botticelli's time in Rome would come to an end in 1482, where he had been for around 10 months, and would be among the very last trips he would make away from his home. Primavera, circa 1482, is the earliest of the 2 masterworks, both depicting subjects of classical mythology on a scale that was unprecedented at this time. Primavera is deeply complex, not only as an art piece, but also in its meaning, to which are several theories, but none are concrete, as there is a lot of doubt as to who actually conceptualised the composition, as it was almost certainly not Botticelli himself, as the knowledge of classical mythology within the work is considered too great to be of his mind alone. To help you understand what we are looking at, from left to right we can see Mercury, a major Roman god of commerce, gain and travel. The three Graces, minor Greek goddesses of beauty and human creativity. Venus, the major Roman goddess of fertility, sex and desire. Flora, a Roman fertility goddess of flowers and the season of spring. Chloris, the nymph or goddess loved by Zephyrus, and Zephyrus himself, a minor Greek god of the west wind. The motion or movement of the work, however, is not from left to right, it is in fact from right to left. Zephyrus, Chloris and Flora are all connected within the mythology. Chloris was a nymph kidnapped by Zephyrus, whom he would marry and turn into a deity, Flora being the deity she turns into, hence the overlapping. The central arches serve to draw the eye under which Venus herself is staring back at her audience, as Cupid above her raises his cocked arrow to the left of the scene, where two of the Graces are looking at each other and one looking off in Mercury's direction, who himself is looking away from the scene. Between his two great works are the more underappreciated, but nonetheless distinctive, of his artistic temperament during this period, his Venus and Mars, along with the Pallas and the Centaur. All of the works of this period would feature a distinct and appealing, almost ephemeral undertone of soft linear lines chastely retained by the early Gothic style, and put forth to the viewer in only a way that can be described, and was by Vasari, as grace. Perhaps no other work from the entire Renaissance would capture such a word as Botticelli would in his next masterpiece to follow. The Birth of Venus, circa 1485, is arguably Botticelli's most famous contribution of all time, and perhaps his most recognisable work. It is spectacular in many respects, and rightly serves as an icon of the early Renaissance. On the left is Zephyr, holding Aura, the embodiment of a slight breeze in his arms, blowing the wind to the right of the scene. The wind can perhaps be viewed as the flow or the motion of this work, blowing Venus closer to the shore and catching the dress of what is believed to be one of the Hours, an attendant of Venus, and in particular, Hora of Spring. Interpretations vary. Perhaps the nude Venus represents the Neoplatonic ideal of divine love. Other interpretations of Venus come from ancient art, as her nude pose is emblematic of poses from antiquity, reminiscent of the Venus of Modesty theme, such as the Venus de Medici in Rome, which, given its true date of emergence is unclear, could possibly have been studied by Botticelli during his stay there, but this is, of course, unsubstantiated. Over the years, many art historians and scholars have debated its meaning, and still do to this day. The theories are wide and notable, even fanciful in some cases. One art historian had convinced himself that the most beautiful woman of the age in Florence, Simonetta Vespucci, posed nude for Botticelli, as the likeness of a portrait Botticelli would create of her would have a resemblance to the Botticelli's Venus. However, It is not at all clear whether he is imposing his Venus onto Simonetta, or Simonetta onto his Venus, the former seeming the more likely the case. The modern approach for both Primavera and Birth is more layered, as perspectives on a spectrum rather than holding one singular message. Sadly, the pigmentation and or hue of these works are off from their intended original due to the green pigment used being exposed to light during its life, making both works darker than perhaps originally intended. But clearly this has not dampened the master's work in terms of the future generation's enjoyment. Aside from his mythological masterworks, 1480 would also mark perhaps Botticelli's most productive decade in terms of what can accurately be dated, as indeed most of his dated work comes from this period. Mostly religious works, as would and was his staple, and one could imagine after returning from Rome, his status and name had spread as a result. By this time began what was a flight of the great artists from Florence, major names of both today and the times, such as Da Vinci in 1481, Pollaiuolo brothers in 1484, Verrocchio in 1485. Botticelli would remain in Florence along with the other Florentine masters, such as his own once apprentice, Filippino. Mid to late 1480s, two altarpieces, one of 1485 and another in perhaps 1487, the former marking perhaps his most major commission since Rome. This period of production would continue into the early 1490s, where a number of further religious works were created. However, as of 1495, Botticelli's production rate would begin to decline for more personal pursuits, such as his engravings of Dante's Divine Comedy, whom he had had a fondness for his whole life. Around 1490, a Dominican friar, Girolamo Savonarola, began preaching in Florence. Savonarola's impact over the near 8 years he was in Florence was, considering the length of time, quite dramatic, and Botticelli, according to Vasari, became one of his followers. Exactly how much influence this had upon him is indeed debatable, but has marred his history nonetheless. Some famous accounts describe Botticelli burning one or multiple of his works in what was known as the Bonfire of the Vanities, an equally famous fire of 1497. Spurred on by the followers of Savonarola, where many pieces of art and literature were destroyed. As far as Botticelli burning his own works in the fire, it seems more that this is a convenient tale or fable, concocted due to his connection with Savonarola, a fanciful story rather than a truth. It is believed instead that his brother, Simone, was more closely involved with the friar. Vasari's belief that he did not paint anything after coming under the Dominican sway seems also to be false. The 1490s also show a return to ancient history, with the Calumny of Apollo, a recreation of an ancient Greek allegory from around 1494 to 95, along with the story pairs of Lucretia and Virginia. However, there was still an occasional Madonna from this period, and two of my personal favourites, the Annunciation and Despair. The mystical Nativity, comparatively small and perhaps personal, a take on the well-established Christian subject of the Nativity of Jesus. Finally, around the dawn of the 1500s is when Botticelli created his scenes from the life of Saint Zenobius, from which 4 panels survive. These panels mark for many art historians the true twilight or final phase of his career, and some even regard these panels as his final contribution, believed to be around 1500 to 1505. A strange epistle perhaps. Botticelli would live on until 1510, where Vasari describes the master as in ill health and unable to walk without the aid of crutches for his last years. The picture Vasari paints of him in his last days is unflattering to say the least. Strange, however, that life has its little ways. Botticelli died in May, and what is considered his final work, his depiction of Saint Zenobius, seems in the face a fitting end. For Zenobius' feast day, where Florence's first bishop is venerated, is in the month of May, and indelibly, amid the feasts and celebrations, must have remained the name of one of his earliest depictors, Sandro Botticelli. His body would lay in the burial yard of the church he was baptised in.